The Consumer Price Index (CPI) measures the change over time in the general price level of goods and services that households acquire for the purpose of consumption. The year-on-year inflation rate, as measured by the CPI, was 7.8% in August 2019, with an index of 108.7. Alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and narcotic, representing 12.9%, was the key driver of August's inflation. The government statistician, Professor Samuel Kobna Enim, in a release on 18th September 2019, indicated that as part of GSS's continuous commitment to improving on the quality of her product, the CPI has been rebased. The new series has 2018 as the reference period, and it is an expanded basket over the previous one, which had 2012 as the reference period.
Index, and it's my privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to walk you through 6 different key areas. The first area would be the definition, the data computations of both consumer price index and inflation. The second component, I'm going to touch on the rationale and processes for rebasing CPI. I kindly request that we pay particular attention to these 2 components ahead of the release itself, because the index that we're going to release has to be put in a context, and the context is the definitions that we are using, how we are getting the data, and the computational processes that we've gone through. So the third component will be the release of the CPI and the inflation for August 2019. The fourth component will be disaggregation of August 2019 inflation rate, where we're going to look at food and non-food inflation. We're going to look at inflation from the perspectives of locally produced goods and imported goods. Then we'll narrow down to the regional inflationary rate, where we'll further do the food and non-food inflation. Then, the last but one, we talk about highlights based on the CPI inflation rate for August 2019. Then finally, we're going to share with you next steps. Again, this is an area that we need to pay particular attention to, so that you know the limits within which we are working and what we anticipate moving forward we ought to do to improve the statistics that we generate at Ghana Statistical Service. So it is worthwhile mentioning that CPI measures changes in the price of a fixed basket of goods and services purchased by households. The assumption inherent is that the basket is purchased each month, and what we expect is that once you collect the data on a monthly basis, as price changes, the total price for the basket would also change. The third issue we put emphasis on is the fact that CPI does not measure price levels. CPI measures changes in price. This is important so that when we are articulating changes, we should know that it is not the prices itself that has changed. So reference is made to the base year, so that whatever we have as the base year is what is going to inform the changes that we expect moving forward. It is important to also distinguish between CPI and cost of living index, and the emphasis here is that CPI is a price perspective measure and cost of living is an expenditure-oriented measure. What this means is that cost of living is simply thinking about the minimum expenditure that one will require to maintain a certain standard of living. CPI, in contrast to that, although it also looks at prices, does not focus on the expenditure, it simply focuses on changes in prices. So premised on this, I'll walk you through the rationale and processes. Why do we do rebasing? Rebasing is necessary because over time, the consumption patterns of consumers change. Technology, taste, and preferences change over time. So it's important that as a country, we move away from the old basket of goods that we deal with. That is what informed the need to do rebasing, and this exercise is allowing us to use the most recent Ghana Living Standard Survey to identify the basket of commodities that reflect current consumption patterns to enable us capture changes in prices based on actually what households are consuming. The first process is to define a fixed basket of items based on an updated household expenditure survey. And as I indicated earlier, in Ghana, our most recent household living expenditure survey was the 2017 Ghana Living Standard Survey. Based on the survey, we determine weight associated with the items, and these weights are identified based on the expenditure on the various items that we identify from the survey. Based on this, we identify a base year to offer a common reference point for price comparison. So for this rebasing that we are doing, the reference for the basket of items and the weight are 2017, and as I indicated, is coming from the 7th round of the Ghana Living Standard Survey. And the reference period for price, which indicates the base year that we're going to make the comparison with, is 2018. That is when we started collecting new set of prices to inform our engagement. It is important to highlight three issues that makes this rebasing not comparable to the previous CPIs and inflation that we released. So the items that we had in the old basket were 267, and in the new basket we had 307. This is indicating about 15% change between the old basket and the new basket. We also have to emphasize that the number of observations here is observations, not brands. The reason being that for a particular brand, we can have different observations of it. And the old basket, we have 25,444, and in the new basket, we have 39,963. This corresponds to over 57% change between the old basket and the new basket. Prominent of it is the fact that previously we've been relying on the COICOP classification, and the COICOP is classification of individual consumption according to purpose. We're relying on the 1998 COICOP classification, but moving into the rebasing exercise, we're relying on the most recent, which is the 2018 COICOP classification. Having highlighted the context in which the release is being made, I now have the opportunity to share with you the rebase CPI for August 2019. So the rebase CPI for August 2019 is 108.7, and that relates to 100.8 in the case of August 2018. Given these two indices, it tells us that August 2019 inflation is 7.8. August 2019 inflation is 7.8. This means that the annual year-on-year inflation rate for August 2019 is 7.8, and I put emphasis on the fact that we are not reporting monthly changes because this is the first time we are doing the rebasing, so there wouldn't be any basis to report on the monthly changes. Literally, this means that in the month of August, there's a change in the general price level by 7.8% higher than the prices in August 2018. To reiterate the point, this 7.8 that we are announcing cannot be compared with previous inflation rate, and that is based on the context that we gave earlier on. We move on to the disaggregation, and as I indicated earlier on, the disaggregation is done by food inflation and non-food inflation, and the 7.8 that we are recording for August 2019 is mainly driven by food inflation, and the differential between food inflation and non-food inflation is 0.8%. Another disaggregation that we do is by locally produced items and imported items, and the differential inflationary rate is 0.3%, with locally produced inflation being 7.9% and imported items recording 7.6%. Inflation is largely driven by alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and narcotics, which records 12.9, and the least of this is insurance and financial services. Further disaggregation based on the food inflation indicates that fruits and nuts category is driving food inflation with a rate of 25.2, and the least being fish and other seafood, recording the least of 6.3%. For non-food inflation is mainly driven, as I indicated earlier on, by alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and narcotics, recording 12.9%, as was mentioned earlier on, and insurance and financial services recording 0.3%. Further disaggregation by region indicates that Greater Accra region is driving the inflation that we have, recording an inflation figure of 12.4, followed by Upper West region with 11.8%. The region with the least inflation is Eastern, recording 3.9%. If you further disaggregate it within Greater Accra to find out the specific items that are driving inflation in Greater Accra, we have identified 4 items that are record inflation rates that are greater than the average for Greater Accra. Education services 21.8%, restaurant and accommodation services 16.5%, food and non-alcoholic beverages 15.0%, and personal care, social protection, and miscellaneous goods and services recording 13.6%. So these four items are recording an average more than the 12.4 that is being recorded in Greater Accra region. A further disaggregation based on food inflation, again within the Greater Accra region, points to the fact that cereals and cereal products have 17.6% and live animals, meat, and other parts of slaughtered land animals 17.0. These inflationary rates, that is 17.6 and 17.0, are greater than the food inflation for Greater Accra region, which is 15.0%. So these are the two items that are driving food inflation in Greater Accra region. Upper West region has the highest non-food inflation rate of 12.1%, and within this 12.1%, the drivers are alcoholic beverages recording 21.8%, housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels 16.5%, furnishing, housing, equipment, and routine maintenance 15.0%, and again, education services 13.6%. So these four items have inflation rates that are higher than the average for Upper West region, which is 12.1%. Highlights from the August 2019 rebase CPI and inflation. The year-on-year August 2019 inflation was 7.8%. In August 2019, the differential inflation rate between food and non-food inflation was 0.8%, food inflation 8.2%, and non-food inflation 7.4%. The differential inflation rate for locally produced items and imported items recorded a differential of 0.3%, with locally produced items recording 7.9% and imported items recording 7.6%. Four regions, Greater Accra, Upper West, Central, and Volta, recorded inflation rates above the national average, which was 7.8%. Specifically, Greater Accra recorded 12.4%, Upper West 11.8%, Central 9.1%, and Volta 8.4%. All these rates are higher than the national average of 7.8%. Eastern region recorded the lowest year-on-year inflation rate of 3.9%. I move on to next steps and what we intend to do at Ghana Statistical Service to sustain a continuous improvement of the statistics that we generate. It is imperative for us to think about CPI for the 6 newly created regions, and exercise on this has started vigorously, and our expectation is that should all things go as expected, by the end of the year we should release CPI and inflation for all 16 regions in the country. Moving forward, next month when we're releasing the September inflation, we're expecting that we're going to do the chain link, which will give us an opportunity to have a historical perspective or comparison of the rebase CPI, so that over time we'll get a sense of what has happened. Thirdly, we're looking at the possibility of automating the estimation procedure through the development of a reproducible analytical pipeline. This is a routine activity that GSS does on a monthly basis, and the practice where we use one-off Excel and other statistical software approaches to do it is laborious and time-consuming. And again, based on our relationship with the Office of National Statistics in the UK, we're seeing how we can employ data science techniques to develop a reproducible analytical pipeline, which would help us just feed the data into this pipeline for the statistics to be generated. Fourthly, we say that it is important at the national level, this goes beyond Ghana Statistical Service, as a country for us to think about the weighing of items to inform pricing. This is a challenge with the quantity that is associated with prices of data that we collect from the market. If we get into the market and the market woman says that this heaps cost this amount, this is largely influenced by seasonality, perceptions, and attitude. There's no scientific approach by which the pricing is done, especially for items that are weighted. So the proposal that Ghana Statistical Service is going to put on the floor of Parliament is that as a country we should begin to think about how we can get our market sellers to get us prices based on the weight of the item rather than based on heaps and guesswork and seasonality moving forward. The fifth item is to explore other alternatives, specifically the use of VAT receipts and the deployment of scanners to help improve on the accuracy of the data that we collect. This is imperative because this is what other countries are doing to improve on the quality of statistics. Sending market readers out on a monthly basis has some challenges, but once we are able to scan the data sets, the receipts, and we have the VAT receipt, it's going to contribute to the accuracy of the data that we release. Also, there is an opportunity for us to look at what is happening with the evolution of supermarkets in the country, where we can easily tap into big data and will not be relying on the small markets for the prices, because we all would expect that all the commodities and all of us would go into these supermarkets and patronize goods and services from there. Another intervention would be the reliance on internet and newspapers for price scraping. You'd all would attest to the fact that now there are a number of outlets that are putting their prices on the internet, and regularly we see in the dailies that commodities and their prices are being advertised. So it's an option that we can reduce the errors associated with sending market readers into the market to pick the prices for us. All this would be made possible based on our continuous engagement with peer institutions, specifically Statistics Denmark and the Office of the National Statistics. And I take this opportunity to acknowledge the immense support that we've received from these two organizations for this rebasing exercise, where they respectively looked at the computational approaches and the communication approaches associated with this rebasing exercise. Further to this, it is worth mentioning that IMF continues to give us the needed support so that our statistics would meet the quality that is expected of it. Thank you very much.